The last loaf of bread. That was all Mira and her mother had left. If they ate it, they'd survive the night. If they didn't, they might not survive the winter. Then someone knocked. Mira opened the door. A stranger stood outside, barely able to remain on his feet. Snow clung to his shoulders. Hunger hollowed his face. His voice trembled. "Please, do you have anything to eat?" Mira looked at the stranger, then at the only loaf standing between her mother and another night without food. She knew exactly what that bread meant. She also knew exactly what hunger looked like. Without asking his name, she broke the loaf. Her mother silently gave him her own share. The stranger accepted it with shaking hands. He thanked them and disappeared into the snow. By sunrise, the tiny village shook beneath the sound of hundreds of galloping horses. Mira thought they had come to arrest her. Instead, every royal soldier dropped to one knee before the hungry stranger she had fed the night before. Before we begin, like the video and subscribe for more unforgettable werewolf romance stories. Winter had swallowed Eldoria whole. Snow buried roads that merchants once traveled every day. Rivers froze into silent sheets of ice. Smoke rose from village chimneys only when families still had enough wood to burn. Those who didn't simply wrapped themselves in blankets and prayed morning would come. In the little border village of Willowbrook, the bakery owned by Mira and her widowed mother had become quieter with every passing week. There had been a time when laughter filled its walls before sunrise. Farmers stopped to buy fresh loaves on their way to the fields. Children pressed eager faces against the windows, waiting for sweet rolls to cool. Now, the shelves stood almost empty. Flour had become expensive. Customers had become poorer. Even the smell of fresh bread seemed rarer than it once had. Mira slid the final loaf from the stone oven and placed it gently upon the wooden counter. Her mother watched it in silence. Neither woman spoke. They both knew exactly what it represented. Not profit, survival. If they ate it, they would survive another night. If they sold it tomorrow, they might earn enough flour to bake again. Either choice meant going hungry. Neither felt like hope. Many miles away, another journey had begun, for very different reasons. Every winter since ascending the throne, Alpha King Caspar Valerian disappeared from the palace for several days without ceremony. Only one man ever accompanied him, Sir Garin Holt, captain of the Royal Guard. Even Garin never rode beside him. That defeated the purpose. Caspar believed what his late father had once told him. A king who learns about his people only through reports will eventually rule numbers instead of lives. So each winter, he became nobody. A plain traveler wearing worn clothes. No royal escort. No banners, no crown. Only Garin following far enough behind to intervene if death became unavoidable. The kingdom believed its king remained safely inside the palace during these journeys. Very few knew the truth. Caspar preferred it that way. People spoke honestly when they believed no king was listening. For 2 days, the journey had gone exactly as planned. Caspar listened. He visited forgotten villages, shared meals inside modest homes, learned which roads had become dangerous, which bridges needed repair, which taxes weighed most heavily upon ordinary families. Then, the mountain storm arrived. Snow blinded both horse and rider. A frightened stag burst across the narrow mountain trail. Caspar's horse slipped. The animal recovered. His saddlebags did not. Food, water, blankets, everything tumbled into the icy river below before disappearing beneath rushing ice. Garin finally caught up. "My king, we should return." Caspar shook his head. "If I ride back now, I'll never know how people survive when everything goes wrong." Garin looked toward the darkening sky. "Then at least allow me to reveal who you are." "No." Caspar adjusted the worn cloak around his shoulders. "If kindness only appears after a crown is recognized, then it isn't kindness." They continued. By the following afternoon, hunger had become impossible to ignore. Caspar knocked on the first cottage. An elderly man opened the door. "I'm sorry," the old man's voice cracked. "I have grandchildren inside." He quietly closed the door. At the second home, A woman apologized before he even finished asking. "We've nothing left." At the third, no one answered, although he could hear movement behind the shutters. Caspar didn't blame them. Fear made people protect what little remained. By sunset, he had stopped counting the doors. The cold reached his bones. His legs felt heavier with every step. Ahead, one final lantern glowed through the snowfall. A bakery. Inside, Mira was placing another log into the fire when she heard the knock. Soft, almost uncertain. She opened the door. A traveler stood beneath the falling snow. His cloak was torn. His boots were soaked. His face carried the exhaustion of someone who had walked far longer than he should have. Yet despite everything, there was dignity about him. Not pride, discipline. The kind no hardship could erase. He lowered his eyes. "I know it's late." His voice sounded rough from the cold. "But, do you have anything left to eat?" Mira looked toward the counter. The final loaf. Her mother followed her gaze. Neither spoke. The silence lasted only a heartbeat. Her mother reached for the knife. Mira gently stopped her. She picked it up herself. The blade passed cleanly through the warm bread. Then again, 3 equal pieces, one for her mother, one for herself, one for the stranger. Caspar stared at the bread resting in Mira's hands. "I can't pay you." "You don't have to. I've nothing to give." Mira smiled softly. "Then, perhaps one day, you'll do the same for someone else." Something changed inside Caspar, not because she had fed him, many generous people existed, but because she had shared equally. She had not given him leftovers. She had made him part of their table. He accepted the bread carefully, as though accepting something far greater than food. That evening, they spoke quietly beside the fire. Caspar asked about the village. Never about politics, only people, Mira answered honestly. The mill had broken months earlier. Farmers now traveled almost a day's journey to grind grain. Many simply couldn't afford it. The village school had closed because the teacher left seeking work elsewhere. Winter taxes had forced several families to sell livestock they desperately needed. Her mother never complained. She simply described life exactly as it was. Caspar listened. Mostly, he listened. When silence finally settled over the bakery, he realized he had learned more about his kingdom in one evening than from the last 6 council meetings combined. Before sunrise, he quietly thanked them, then disappeared into the snow. The thunder arrived just after dawn. Hoofbeats, hundreds of them. The entire village rushed outside. Children clung to frightened parents. Farmers whispered nervously. No one had ever seen so many royal soldiers. Mira stepped into the doorway. Her heart sank. Had someone accused them of a crime? The royal column stopped before the bakery. Sir Garin rode forward. Then, to everyone's astonishment, he dismounted, turned, and bowed. Every soldier behind him followed. Caspar removed the plain traveller's cloak from his shoulders. Beneath it gleamed the black and silver mantle of Eldoria's Alpha King. Gasps spread through the crowd. Villagers dropped to their knees. Mira stood frozen. The hungry traveller was their king. Caspar walked toward her. "I came here searching for the truth about my kingdom." His voice carried across the silent square. "I found it." He turned toward the gathered villagers. Effective immediately. Winter taxes for Willowbrook are cancelled. Disbelief swept through the crowd. The royal treasury will repair the village mill before spring. Tears filled old farmers' eyes. The Everwin bakery will be fully restored at the crown's expense. Mira stared speechless. No family in this village will go hungry this winter. He looked across the people one final time, then toward Mira. No kingdom deserves prosperity. If kindness only survives inside palaces, when the royal procession finally departed, the snow continued falling. But something had changed. By evening, every neighboring village had already heard the story. Not about the king, about the young baker who had shared her last loaf with a hungry stranger. People began calling her the bread girl. The story of the bread girl traveled farther than anyone expected. Merchants carried it from village to village. Traveling blacksmiths repeated it beside roadside fires. Children laughed while pretending to feed imaginary kings with pieces of bread. By the time spring softened the frozen roads, people across Eldoria knew only one version of the story. A poor baker's daughter had unknowingly fed the Alpha King his last meal before hunger overcame him. But no one knew what happened afterward. Least of all Mira. Life inside the little bakery quickly became busy again. Royal carpenters repaired the cracked roof before the spring rains arrived. New ovens replaced the old stone furnace that had barely held heat. Fresh sacks of flour arrived every month under the king's decree. The broken village mill was rebuilt exactly as promised. For the first time in years, farmers smiled as they returned carrying grain instead of worries. Yet the greatest change was not inside the bakery, it was inside the people. Hope had returned. Not because they had become wealthy, because someone had finally remembered they existed. Mira refused to let the royal gifts change the way she lived. Every morning before sunrise, she still tied on the same plain linen apron. She still kneaded every loaf herself. She still swept the bakery floor before opening the doors. Whenever customers thanked her for saving the village, she always answered the same way. "I only shared bread." An elderly farmer would shake his head. "No, child. You reminded the king who he was feeding." 3 weeks later, another traveler entered the bakery. His cloak looked different, cleaner. His beard had been trimmed. But Mira recognized the eyes immediately. "You came back." Casper smiled. "I promised I would pay for the bread." She folded her arms. "I don't remember inviting a king to stand in line with ordinary customers." He laughed quietly. "I wasn't asking as a king. I was hoping to buy today's bread before the farmers do." She handed him a fresh loaf. "You'll have to wait your turn like everyone else." The customers chuckled. No one inside the bakery realized they had just watched the Alpha King lose an argument over bread. Casper waited patiently. When everyone else had been served, he remained sitting near the warm oven while Mira cleaned the counter. "You didn't come all this way just for bread." "No." "What then?" He looked around the empty bakery. "I came because there was something I forgot to do." "And what's that?" "Listen." She frowned. "You listened the whole night you were here." "I heard people. This time, I'd like to hear you." Over the next several months, the king returned often. Never with royal banners, never with guards filling the streets, only as the quiet traveler Mira had first met during the storm. Sometimes he helped unload sacks of flour. Sometimes he repaired loose fence posts behind the bakery. Sometimes he simply sat while villagers came and went. He asked questions no ruler had ever asked. What worries mothers most? What makes young people leave their villages? What would convince farmers to stay? Mira answered without realizing she was teaching a king. "Stop making decisions from palaces." He looked up. "What do you mean?" "If a road floods every spring, send the people who decide where taxes go. Let them carry grain across the mud themselves. They'll approve repairs before the next winter." Casper laughed. "I suspect my council would hate you." She shrugged. "Only until they crossed the road." Another afternoon he asked, "What is the greatest wealth a kingdom can possess?" She expected him to answer first. Instead, he waited. She thought for a long moment. Trust. He leaned forward. "Not gold. Gold can be stolen. Not armies. They can be defeated. Trust? If people believe their ruler truly sees them, they'll carry the kingdom through its darkest years." Casper said nothing, but later that evening, he quietly crossed out an entire section of the economic reforms his ministers had prepared. Mira would never know it. Summer arrived. Trade returned. Villages once forgotten slowly came back to life. Inside the palace, ministers began noticing something unusual. The king had started asking different questions. Instead of, "How much grain did we collect?" he asked, "How many families still skipped meals?" Instead of, "How much tax was received?" he asked, "Which village struggled most to pay it?" The council couldn't understand what had changed. Only Casper knew. A baker's daughter had quietly begun reshaping the kingdom without ever leaving her village. One evening, Casper remained after the bakery had closed. Mira's mother excused herself upstairs, leaving the two of them beside the dying fire. "You've been unusually quiet today," Mira said. "I've been thinking." Dangerous habit. He smiled. It usually is. She poured 2 cups of herbal tea. So, what troubles a king? He looked directly at her. For months I've watched how people respond to you. She frowned. They don't admire your kindness. They trust it. She looked away. I've done nothing extraordinary. You've done something rarer. You've never changed. Silence settled gently between them. Finally, Caspar spoke again. Mira, I have a question. She looked up. If I asked you to leave this village, would you? Her smile disappeared. Why? Because I need someone beside me. She searched his face. As an advisor. He slowly shook his head. As my queen. The words stole the air from the room. She stared at him in disbelief. Then, very quietly, no. Caspar blinked. You answered rather quickly. Because you're asking the wrong woman. I'm asking the only woman I've been able to think about for months. She stood and walked toward the bakery window. Outside, children played beside the rebuilt mill. Farmers laughed as wagons rolled through streets that finally held hope again. She spoke without turning around. I know what people will say. They'll say the baker's daughter trapped the Alpha King. They'll say kindness was only another way of climbing toward a crown. I won't allow that. Caspar crossed the room. He stopped beside her. Mira, when I first knocked on this door, I believed I was searching for the truth about my kingdom. I was wrong. She slowly looked at him. I was searching for the woman who would remind me how to rule it. You don't need another noble. You don't need another politician. You need someone wiser than both. He gently took her flower-covered hands into his own. I am not asking because you fed a hungry traveler. I am asking because every decision you make begins with another person's dignity. That is the first duty of a queen. Tears gathered in Mira's eyes, not because she dreamed of wearing a crown, because for the first time, someone had seen the woman she truly was. Several moments passed before she answered. If I say yes, I will never pretend to be someone I'm not. I wouldn't marry you if you did. A small smile finally appeared. Then, yes. Far away, inside the royal palace, wedding bells had not yet rung. But before another sunrise, rumors already had. The Alpha King intended to marry a baker's daughter, and across Eldoria, disbelief spread faster than celebration. The wedding celebrations lasted 3 days. The whispers lasted longer. Every corridor inside the royal palace carried the same question. How could the Alpha King have chosen a village baker over every noblewoman in the kingdom? Mira heard none of it directly. She didn't have to. People became strangely quiet whenever she approached. Servants bowed, then exchanged uncertain glances after she passed. Ladies of the court smiled politely while measuring every movement she made. The palace had accepted her title. It had not accepted her. The only person who never treated her differently was Caspar. On the morning after the celebrations ended, he found her standing alone on the eastern balcony, overlooking the capital. The city stretched endlessly beneath the morning sun. Smoke curled from thousands of chimneys. Market stalls were opening. Bakers carried fresh loaves into the streets. The sight made Mira smile. You miss it. Alpha King Caspar's voice was gentle. She nodded. I miss knowing where I belong. He stepped beside her. I didn't marry you because I wanted another queen trained by tutors. I married you because you see people the rest of us stopped noticing. She looked toward the city again. I hope your kingdom agrees. So do I. The following weeks tested every confidence she possessed. Royal etiquette lessons began before sunrise. How to address foreign rulers. How to receive ambassadors. Which fork belonged to which course. Which traditions could never be broken. By the end of each day, her head ached. Every mistake felt enormous. Once she accidentally greeted an elderly duke before acknowledging his wife. The court fell silent. Another afternoon, she addressed an ambassador, using the customs of the wrong province. Several nobles exchanged amused smiles. She apologized, corrected herself, continued. Every evening she studied until the candles burned low. Not because she wanted approval, because she refused to embarrass the man who had believed in her. Lord Varick remained her loudest critic. During one council meeting, he finally voiced what many others had only whispered. "Your Majesty," he began politely, "compassion is admirable. But ruling a kingdom requires more than a generous heart." Several council members lowered their eyes. Others waited eagerly. Mira met his gaze. "I agree." That answer surprised him. "It requires judgment. It requires difficult decisions. It requires knowing when kindness must yield to reason." Mira nodded slowly. "And where do you believe kindness ends and reason begins?" Lord Varric answered immediately. "When difficult choices appear." She smiled softly. "I believe that's precisely where kindness is tested." The chamber grew quiet. No one applauded. No one argued. The discussion simply continued. When the meeting ended, several ministers who had expected a confrontation found themselves thinking about her answer long after they had left. Despite moments like that, the palace life remained lonely. Every success felt borrowed. Every mistake felt permanent. One rainy evening, after another exhausting day of lessons and council meetings, Mira returned to her chambers. The palace attendants helped remove the sapphire crown, then the embroidered royal gown. When they left, silence settled over the room. She walked toward a small cedar chest she had brought from Willowbrook. Inside lay the simple brown dress she had worn while baking bread beside her mother. She lifted it carefully. The fabric still carried the faint scent of flour. Without thinking, she changed into it. Standing before the mirror, she barely recognized herself. The village girl looked familiar. The queen did not. She touched the plain sleeves with trembling fingers, then whispered the thought she had hidden from everyone. They wanted a queen. Her voice cracked. They received a baker. For several long moments, she simply stared at her own reflection. Then she made a decision. Quietly, she removed a small travel satchel from beneath the bed. She folded the brown dress inside, added a cloak, a pair of boots, nothing more. If she left before dawn, the court would celebrate. The nobles would stop fighting Alpha King Caspar. He could marry someone worthy of the throne. Perhaps that had always been the better future. She had just fastened the satchel when a calm voice came from the doorway. "Are you finished packing?" Mira froze. King Caspar stood there, not angry, not disappointed, simply watching. She couldn't bring herself to turn around. Almost. He stepped into the room. His eyes rested on the satchel, then on the old dress she wore. "I've been looking for you." She forced herself to speak. "I thought you deserved someone who belongs here." He was silent for a long moment, then asked quietly, "When I knocked on your bakery door, did you know who I was?" She shook her head. "No. You only saw someone who was hungry." Another silence. Then he spoke again. "And now, you're looking at yourself the same way everyone else did." She closed her eyes. "I don't belong here." Alpha King Caspar walked closer, stopping only when he stood beside her. Still, he didn't touch her, didn't reach for the satchel, didn't ask her to stay. Instead, he said the words she would remember for the rest of her life. "If you leave, I'll spend the rest of my life surrounded by people who know how to rule a palace, but none who know how to love a kingdom." The room fell completely still. For the first time since entering the palace, Mira understood. He had never asked her to become someone else. He had only asked her to remain herself. Slowly, she knelt beside the satchel, removed the folded cloak, then the boots, finally the dress, one piece at a time, until the bag was empty again. Caspar smiled, not because he had won, because she had. Later that evening, unable to sleep, Mira wandered into the palace kitchens. The head cook looked startled. "Your Majesty, I hope I'm not interrupting." He quickly bowed. "Never." She rolled up her sleeves. "May I bake?" The cooks exchanged confused glances. Queens did not usually ask permission to knead dough. Mira smiled. "I've always thought better with flour on my hands." Soon, warm bread filled the ovens. The kitchen staff watched in fascination. She laughed while dusting flour across the table. She taught young apprentices simple tricks her mother had shown her years before. For the first time since arriving at the palace, she felt like herself again. As the loaves cooled, Her attention drifted towards several untouched trays from the royal banquet. Perfectly good bread, roasted vegetables, fresh fruit. None of it had been served. What happens to all this? One young cook hesitated. It'll be thrown away before morning. Mira stared at him. All of it? He nodded. There are rules. She looked back at the untouched food, then toward the palace windows, where the lights of the city flickered in the darkness. Somewhere beyond those walls, she knew children were going to bed hungry. The next morning she requested permission to address the council. Lord Varick listened impatiently as she explained her proposal. Every untouched meal prepared inside the palace should be delivered each evening to orphanages, hospitals, monasteries, and widow houses, instead of being discarded. Several nobles exchanged doubtful looks. One minister laughed quietly. We're discussing scraps. Lord Varick folded his hands. Your Majesty, the Royal Council concerns itself with matters of state. Before Mira could answer, every eye turned toward Caspar. Surely the Alpha King would intervene. Caspar remained seated, calmly folded his hands, then said only 4 words. My queen can answer. Nothing more. Silence filled the chamber. For the first time, no one looked at Alpha King Caspar. They looked only at Mira. She stood. If a kingdom wastes food while its children are hungry, then hunger is no longer the people's failure. It becomes the crown's. No one spoke, not even Lord Varick. The proposal passed before sunset. That evening, the first wagons left the palace, carrying untouched bread, vegetables, meat, and fruit. The following morning, the palace servants returned to work with quiet smiles. One elderly maid approached Mira before dawn. My grandson ate palace bread last night. She bowed deeply. Thank you, Your Majesty. As the woman walked away, Mira looked toward the palace gates. For the first time since entering the royal palace, she no longer wondered whether she belonged there. She knew exactly why she had been brought there, not to become another queen, but to remind a kingdom that compassion belonged inside a palace just as much as it belonged inside a little village bakery. The palace food wagons became part of the kingdom's nightly routine. Every evening, untouched bread, vegetables, fruit, and warm meals left the royal kitchens. Every dawn, letters of gratitude arrived from orphanages, monasteries, hospitals, and widow houses. For the first time in years, people began speaking of the palace with affection instead of distance. The success encouraged the council. More importantly, it encouraged Mira. She had solved one problem, now she saw another. Every journey beyond the capital revealed the same heartbreaking truth. Children in villages still waited outside empty bakeries. Widows stretched flour meant for 1 week into 2. Entire families skipped meals whenever harvests failed. The palace could feed the capital. It could never feed an entire kingdom. One evening, while studying reports beside the library fire, Mira quietly spoke. We shouldn't wait until people become desperate before helping them. King Caspar looked up from the documents in his hands. What are you thinking? She smiled faintly. A bakery. In every village. He leaned back. Explain. Not royal bakeries. Community bakeries. Places owned by the villagers themselves. The kingdom supplies flour during difficult seasons. The villagers bake together. Everyone contributes what they can. And no child goes hungry simply because their parents had one bad harvest. Caspar listened without interrupting. Finally, he smiled. I think it's a beautiful idea. So do I. Mira's smile faded. But beautiful ideas still have to survive reality. Within weeks, construction began across Eldoria. Old mills reopened. Abandoned bakeries came back to life. Village ovens burned again, after years of silence. People celebrated. The newspapers called it the Bread Queen's greatest gift. Even Lord Varick admitted privately, it may actually work. For several weeks, it did. Children carried fresh loaves home every afternoon. Widows no longer stood in endless lines for charity. Farmers donated flour after successful harvests. Entire villages began baking together. Mira rode through the countryside, watching strangers laugh while kneading dough side by side. She believed, perhaps, the hardest part was over. She was wrong. The first warning arrived quietly. A village elder reported shortages, despite receiving enough flour. Then another village reported the same problem. Then another. Soon, complaints reached every province. Bread disappeared before sunrise. Families who genuinely needed it found empty shelves. Nobody understood why. Mira refused to believe the reports, until she visited a bakery herself. The ovens had been full before dawn. Now, the shelves stood almost empty. A tired widow stared hopelessly across the room. "I came as soon as I finished washing clothes. There isn't anything left." Nearby, a little girl held her mother's hand. She couldn't have been older than 7. She looked toward the empty shelves, then quietly asked, "Mama, I thought you said we'd have bread today." Her mother forced a smile. "We'll come back tomorrow." The baker lowered his head in shame. They were gone before sunrise. Mira frowned. Gone where? The answer sickened her. Wealthy merchants had discovered a loophole. They paid laborers to stand in line before dawn, bought nearly every loaf, then resold the bread across neighboring towns for 3 times its value. A program created for the hungry had become another business. By the following week, the newspapers had turned against her. The bread queen creates bread shortages. Royal charity feeds merchants instead of children. The baker queen doesn't understand economics. The criticism spread quickly. Even honest people began questioning the program. Perhaps Lord Varick had been right. Perhaps compassion really wasn't enough. That night, Mira sat alone inside the palace bakery. The ovens were cold. A single unfinished loaf rested on the wooden table before her. For the first time since becoming queen, she cried. Not because people mocked her, not because the newspapers attacked her, because somewhere across Eldoria, children had gone to sleep hungry because of a decision she had made. She whispered to herself, "I wanted to help. Instead, I made it worse." The empty room offered no answer. Alpha King Caspar found her long after midnight. She quickly wiped away the tears. "I failed them." He looked at the untouched dough, then at her tired eyes. "No, I did. I thought kindness would be enough." Caspar pulled out the chair opposite her. He didn't comfort her with easy words. Instead, he asked, "What have you learned?" She looked down. "That people don't only share bread, they also sell it." He nodded. "What else?" she thought quietly. "Good hearts need good systems." A small smile appeared on Caspar's face. "Then you haven't failed. You've grown." He stood, offered no grand speech, only one sentence before leaving. "I trust the Queen to find the answer." The following morning, the Royal Council assembled. Several nobles demanded the community bakeries be closed immediately. They've become centers of corruption. They're costing the treasury. They're embarrassing the crown. Lord Varick stood. "I respectfully recommend ending the entire program." Every face turned toward Caspar. Surely the Alpha King would rescue his queen. Caspar calmly folded his hands. "My queen can answer for herself." Then, he said nothing more. The chamber became completely silent. Mira slowly stood. "I agree." The council looked confused. "I agree that the current system has failed." A murmur swept through the room. But the problem isn't kindness. It's management. She walked toward the map of Eldoria, then began outlining a completely new system. Each village would elect bread stewards from among widows, teachers, veterans, and clergy. No merchant could purchase community bread. Families with children would receive priority. Every loaf would be recorded publicly. Village councils, not palace officials, would oversee distribution. Anyone caught exploiting the system would lose trading privileges throughout Eldoria. When she finished, the chamber remained silent. Not because they doubted her, because they realized she had spent the entire night solving the problem instead of defending herself. Even Lord Varick slowly lowered his papers. The reforms passed unanimously. The new system spread throughout the kingdom. This time, it worked. Months passed. No shortages, no empty shelves, no merchants exploiting hungry families. The bakeries became something far greater than places to collect bread. They became gathering places. Neighbors solved disputes while kneading dough. Widows taught young girls forgotten family recipes. Retired soldiers repaired broken ovens. Travelers always found a warm meal waiting. People no longer called them community bakeries. They simply called them our bakery. One afternoon, Mira returned to the very village where the little girl had once stood before empty shelves. The same child ran toward her, carrying a freshly baked loaf. "We baked extra today." She proudly held out the bread. "For the travelers." Mira accepted it with trembling hands. The little girl smiled. "No one leaves our village hungry anymore." Mira looked around the bustling bakery. Farmers laughed beside merchants. Children carried warm loaves home. Elderly widows directed the ovens with practiced confidence. She finally understood. Kindness alone had never changed Eldoria. Kindness, guided by wisdom, had. As the evening bells echoed across the valley, Mira quietly thanked the difficult lesson that had almost broken her. When Mira first dreamed of feeding the kingdom, she believed a compassionate heart would be enough. Now she understood something far greater. Compassion may begin change, but only wisdom, humility, and the courage to learn from failure can make that change endure for generations. Spring arrived with promise. The fields surrounding Eldoria turned green once again. Village bakeries flourished. Markets overflowed with grain. For the first time in generations, people no longer feared the coming winter. Visitors from neighboring kingdoms arrived almost weekly. Some came to study Eldoria's schools. Others admired its mills and irrigation canals. Many simply wanted to understand how a kingdom once known for its ordinary harvests had become one of the most prosperous realms on the continent. Every ambassador asked the same question. What changed? The people always answered with quiet pride. Our queen remembered what it feels like to be hungry. Prosperity, however, rarely remained unnoticed. One morning, a royal messenger arrived carrying a banner unlike any the council had seen before. It belonged to Ravenport, a neighboring mountain kingdom. Its ruler, King Aldrich, requested an emergency audience. The council welcomed him with the respect due a fellow sovereign, but no one expected the condition in which he arrived. His royal carriage was covered in mud. His guards looked exhausted. The king's face carried the strain of weeks without sleep. After the formal greetings ended, he spoke without ceremony. "My kingdom is starving." Silence filled the chamber. 3 seasons of relentless drought had destroyed nearly every harvest. Rivers had shrunk into cracked riverbeds. Livestock had died. Entire villages survived on little more than watered grain porridge. Children were the first to suffer. The elderly followed. King Aldrich lowered his head. "I have exhausted every reserve. I have sold treasures that belonged to my family for generations. I have borrowed from every neighboring ruler willing to help." His voice grew quieter. "Eldoria is my final hope." The council immediately requested the treasury reports. Within the hour, they gathered around the great council table. The royal treasurer spoke first. "Eldoria possesses healthy grain reserves, but only enough to guarantee our own people survive should next year's harvest fail." Lord Varick slowly nodded. "If we send Ravenport the amount they require, our emergency reserves will be cut almost in half." Several ministers agreed. "The risk is enormous. What if drought reaches us next year? What if floods destroy our own crops? What if another kingdom requests the same?" Every argument made sense. Every calculation was correct. No one questioned Ravenport's suffering. They questioned whether Eldoria could afford to save them. King Aldrich remained silent throughout the debate. He never pleaded, never argued. He simply waited. Mira watched him carefully. She remembered another face. Another hungry stranger. Another winter. Only this time, an entire kingdom stood at the door. Eventually, every member of the council turned toward Caspar. He was the Alpha King. The final decision belonged to him. Caspar looked around the chamber, then toward Mira. Their eyes met only briefly. He calmly folded his hands upon the council table. Whatever decision is made, history will remember it. Nothing more. He leaned back. The chamber understood immediately. He had placed his complete trust in his queen. No rescue, no direction. Only faith. The room fell silent. Mira slowly rose. She walked toward the great map of the kingdoms spread across the council wall. Her fingers rested upon Eldoria, then moved slowly toward Ravenport. When I was a little girl, my mother once divided our final loaf of bread. She looked around the chamber, not because we had enough, because someone else had nothing. Lord Varric answered gently, "Your Majesty, this is not one hungry traveler. This is an entire kingdom." "I know," she nodded. "And that is exactly why this decision matters." She turned toward the council. "If we protect our grain, and thousands of children die beyond our borders, what exactly have we protected?" No one answered. She continued, "We often believe kindness begins when we have abundance. I believe kindness is proven only when generosity becomes costly." She picked up the royal seal, then signed the order. Eldoria will send half of its emergency grain reserves to Ravenport. Gasps echoed throughout the chamber. Several ministers immediately objected. Lord Varric rose. For the first time since accepting Mira as queen, he openly opposed her. "Your Majesty, mercy without limits becomes recklessness." Mira looked at him with complete respect. "Perhaps, but fear without compassion becomes something far worse." The order stood. For weeks, wagon after wagon departed Eldoria. Thousands of sacks of grain crossed the mountains. Soldiers escorted every convoy. Village children lined the roads waving goodbye as the caravans disappeared toward Ravenport. Many citizens quietly wondered whether they had just witnessed the greatest act of compassion or the greatest mistake their queen had ever made. Summer arrived. Then disaster struck. Weeks of relentless storms swept across Eldoria. The river Aster overflowed. Entire wheat fields disappeared beneath muddy water. Bridges collapsed. Farmers watched helplessly as months of work vanished overnight. The harvest forecasts grew worse every week. Inside the council chamber, fear returned. The royal treasurer spoke with visible concern. "If the floods continue, our remaining reserves may not last until next harvest." No one spoke. The same question haunted every face. Had the queen doomed her own kingdom? Even the people who loved Mira could not ignore the frightening possibility. That evening, Mira stood alone upon the palace balcony. Below her, the city remained peaceful. The people trusted her completely. The weight of that trust felt heavier than any crown. Caspar quietly joined her. "You've been standing here a long time." She nodded. "I keep asking myself the same question. Were they right?" He looked toward the flooded fields beyond the city walls. "What answer do you keep finding?" She closed her eyes. "I would make the same decision again." He smiled. "I know." She looked at him. "You never doubted me." "I doubted the weather." He answered with a soft laugh. "Never you." 3 mornings later, the palace watchmen sounded the eastern horns. Everyone rushed toward the city walls. Across the horizon, thousands of wagons approached. Not soldiers, not invaders. Grain. Endless lines of grain wagons. Each banner carried Ravenport's royal crest. King Aldrich himself rode at their head. The palace gates opened. The king dismounted before Mira and Caspar. Then, before the entire court, he bowed. Deeply. "My people live today, because your people chose courage over comfort." He turned toward the wagons. "We promised ourselves that if Ravenport ever stood again, your kindness would never be forgotten." He smiled warmly. "We have returned every sack." A servant quietly added, "And another equal measure besides." Caspar looked toward the endless line of grain wagons entering the capital. Then back at Mira. "You were right." She smiled gently. "No." He looked at her. "I was wrong first." She rested one hand upon the nearest grain sack. "I believed kindness alone could solve every problem." She looked toward the people unloading the wagons. "It couldn't. I had to learn. I had to fail. And I had to become wiser than the woman who first imagined this." She smiled quietly. That's why this worked. Caspar looked at her with unmistakable pride. You've become exactly the queen this kingdom needed. Mira gently shook her head. No, I've become the queen this kingdom taught me to become. The royal treasurer stared in disbelief. Double. They had returned double. The council erupted into astonished whispers. Lord Varric slowly removed his chain of office. The heavy symbol of his position rested across both hands. He walked toward Mira, then placed it carefully upon the council table before her. The chamber became completely silent. Your Majesty, his voice trembled. I spent my entire life believing kingdoms survived through caution. He lowered his head. You taught me. They survive through courage. Mira gently lifted the chain, then placed it back into his hands. I need wise advisors. She smiled. Not defeated ones. Lord Varric's eyes filled with quiet tears. For the first time, he bowed to her. Not because she wore a crown, because she had earned his deepest respect. Word of Ravenport's gratitude spread farther than any royal decree ever had. Neighboring rulers no longer spoke only of Eldoria's prosperity. They spoke of its character. Trade alliances strengthened. Border disputes quietly disappeared. Kingdoms that had once competed against one another began sharing irrigation systems, farming knowledge, and emergency grain reserves. One act of costly kindness had accomplished what decades of negotiations never could. One visiting king lingered behind after the council had ended. He watched Mira speaking with village elders, as though she had known them her entire life. Finally, he turned toward Caspar. I have ruled for 30 years. Caspar smiled. So have I. The king shook his head. No, I have governed for 30 years. He looked toward Mira again. But somehow, you built a queen every kingdom wishes it had. Caspar followed his gaze. A quiet smile crossed his face. I didn't build her. The visiting king looked surprised. Caspar answered softly, I was simply wise enough not to stand in her way. The king lowered his eyes thoughtfully. For the first time, he understood why Eldoria had become stronger than kingdoms far richer than its own. Late that evening, Mira returned to the palace bakery. She baked one simple loaf, exactly as she had done beside her mother years before. When the bread emerged warm from the oven, Caspar smiled. After everything that happened today, you're baking again? She laughed softly. It helps me remember. Remember what? She looked down at the loaf resting between them. That every great decision still begins the same way, with someone choosing to share. Outside the palace, the bells of Eldoria rang joyfully across the kingdom, not because they had become the richest nation, but because they had become something far rarer. A kingdom whose greatest strength was a queen who never forgot the value of one loaf of bread. The bells rang through Eldoria before sunrise, not for celebration, not for war, for mercy. Messengers rode in from the eastern border, carrying the same terrifying report. A strange fever had spread through 3 mountain villages. Children weakened first, then the elderly. Entire households had sealed themselves indoors, hoping the sickness would simply disappear. It didn't. Fear traveled faster than the illness. Merchants refused to enter the region. Neighboring villages closed their gates. Some demanded the infected settlements be abandoned entirely. Inside the royal council, panic spread almost as quickly. Lord Varric unfolded the reports. If this continues, trade along the eastern road will collapse. Another minister spoke. We should seal the entire province. No one enters. No one leaves. Several nobles agreed immediately. It is the safest course. The chamber fell silent. Every eye turned toward Mira. She rose slowly. When I was a little girl, my mother once told me something. She looked around the room. When people become frightened, they begin protecting themselves. She paused. When leaders become frightened, they begin protecting their reputations. She placed both hands upon the council table. We are not abandoning those villages. Within the hour, the palace courtyard became a whirlwind of movement. Royal wagons were loaded with medicine, blankets, fresh bread, grain, clean water, volunteer physicians, nurses, healers. Before the first wagon departed, Alpha King Caspar approached Mira. "You don't have to go," she smiled gently. "I know. The physicians can manage this. They probably can." He looked at her quietly. "But you're still going." She nodded, because frightened people need to see more than supplies. They need to know their queen came. Caspar took her hands. "Then I'm coming too." She shook her head. "No. The kingdom still needs its king here, and they need their queen there." For a long moment, neither spoke. Finally, Caspar kissed her forehead. "Bring them home." "I will." The eastern villages expected soldiers. Instead, they saw bread wagons, doctors, warm blankets, and at the very front, their queen. Mira stepped down, before anyone could kneel. No ceremonies, no speeches. "Show me the sick." For days, she barely slept. She carried water to exhausted mothers. She comforted frightened children. She helped physicians organize treatment tents. When food became scarce, she baked alongside the village women exactly as she had years before. Flour covered her hands again. Smoke clung to her clothes. No one looking at her would have guessed she wore a crown. One little boy tugged gently at her sleeve. "Are you really the queen?" She smiled. "What do you think?" He looked at the bread in her hands. "I think. Queens don't usually bake." She laughed softly. "Perhaps they should." Back in the capital, Alpha King Caspar governed alone. Each evening a messenger arrived carrying Mira's reports. Not one letter mentioned herself, only the people. "We need more blankets. The Western physicians have arrived safely. The children are beginning to recover. The village well must be rebuilt before autumn." Caspar folded each report carefully, then smiled. She remained exactly who she had always been. 3 weeks later, the fever broke. The physicians declared the danger over. The villagers gathered in the central square. An elderly woman stepped forward carrying something wrapped in linen. "We have nothing worthy of a queen." She unfolded the cloth. Inside rested a simple round loaf, still warm. Mira stared at it. "You baked this?" The woman nodded. "With flour from the grain you brought." The old woman gently placed the loaf into Mira's hands. "Years from now, we won't remember the fever. We'll remember that our queen ate bread beside us." Tears filled Mira's eyes. She accepted the loaf with both hands, as though accepting the greatest treasure in the kingdom. When she returned to the capital, thousands waited outside the palace gates. No trumpets sounded. No royal procession had been prepared. The people simply began applauding, not because she had defeated an army, not because she had signed a treaty, because she had refused to leave them alone. King Caspar descended the palace steps himself. Without speaking, he embraced her before the entire kingdom. The crowd erupted, not into cheers, into something gentler, the sound of a people who knew they were loved. Years passed. Children who had once received bread from the palace bakeries became teachers, physicians, farmers, builders. Many eventually served within the royal government, not because of family names, because they understood service. The kingdom prospered beyond anything the treasury had predicted. Harvests improved, trade flourished, crime steadily declined. Neighboring rulers continued copying Eldoria's reforms. But those who understood the kingdom best knew something outsiders often missed. Its greatest strength had never been its policies. It had become its people. People who had learned that kindness was not weakness. It was the foundation upon which every lasting kingdom was built. One crisp autumn morning, Mira slipped away from the palace without ceremony. She rode only a short distance, to Willowbrook. The little bakery still stood, larger now, brighter. Its windows glowed with the same warmth she remembered as a child. Her mother, now grey-haired but still smiling, stood behind the counter. "You escaped again?" Mira laughed. "For a few hours. I needed to smell bread that wasn't baked in the palace." Together they worked as they always had, mixing dough, laughing quietly, serving neighbors who still insisted on paying full price, despite standing before their queen. Late that afternoon, a timid knock echoed against the bakery door. Mira opened it. A young girl stood outside, no older than 10. Her little brother clung tightly to her hand. Their clothes were patched. Their faces carried the unmistakable look of children who had not eaten that day. The girl lowered her eyes. "I'm sorry. We heard. Sometimes there's bread left." Mira looked toward the shelves. Only one loaf remained, the final loaf of the day. Her mother looked at her, then smiled. Neither woman needed to speak. Mira picked up the loaf. She reached for the knife, then stopped. Instead, she placed the whole loaf into the little girl's hands. The child stared in disbelief. "But what about you?" Mira knelt until they were eye level. "When someone is hungry, bread tastes better when it isn't divided." The little girl smiled through tears. She hugged the loaf tightly before hurrying away with her brother. Mira watched them disappear down the village road. Her mother quietly stood beside her. "You've changed a great many things." Mira shook her head gently. "No." She looked toward the fading sunset. "I've simply spent my life protecting the kindness someone once gave me the chance to keep." Far above the bakery, the evening bells rang softly across Eldoria. Not announcing another royal decree, not celebrating another victory, only marking the close of another ordinary day in an extraordinary kingdom that had learned its greatest lesson from one young woman who had once shared her last loaf of bread with a hungry stranger. Many years later, travelers entering Eldoria often asked the same question: what made this kingdom different? Some expected to hear stories of great military victories. Others assumed a hidden gold mine had transformed its fortunes. A few believed its prosperity must have begun with a brilliant king. The people of Eldoria always smiled before answering. No, it began with bread. The answer confused every visitor, until they heard the story. Children learned it in every village school, not because it had become a legend, because it had become a lesson. Teachers never began with the Alpha King. They began with a hungry stranger, standing outside a tiny bakery on the coldest night of winter. A stranger with empty hands, a young woman with almost nothing, one loaf of bread, one impossible decision, and a choice that changed everything. Whenever a lesson ended, the children always repeated the same words together. Kindness is never measured by how much you have, only by what you're willing to share. Queen Mira never allowed statues of herself to be built. When sculptors presented magnificent designs, she politely refused every one. "If people remember my face, they'll eventually forget the lesson." Instead, she ordered something far simpler. Every community bakery throughout Eldoria displayed a small wooden carving above its entrance. A single loaf of bread, nothing more. No royal crest, no crown, no inscription. Every citizen already knew what it meant. If a traveler arrived hungry, they would never be turned away. Not because the law demanded it, because the kingdom had chosen to become that kind of place. As the years passed, Alpha King Caspar often slipped away from the palace once again. Not alone. Mira always rode beside him. The two of them returned to the roads where their story had begun. Sometimes they stopped in prosperous towns, sometimes in forgotten villages. Sometimes they accepted invitations to share supper with complete strangers. Very few people recognized them. They preferred it that way. One evening, while resting beside a small village well, a young farmer offered them the last 2 warm rolls his wife had baked that morning. "We don't have much," the farmer apologized. "But no one should continue a journey hungry." Caspar looked toward Mira. She smiled before accepting the bread. Neither of them revealed who they were. As they rode away, Caspar quietly laughed. "What?" Mira asked. "I think your kindness has become contagious." She looked back at the little cottage disappearing behind them. "No," she answered softly. "It was always there. People only needed someone to believe it mattered." Time, as it always does, continued its quiet work. Hair turned silver. Children became parents. Parents became grandparents. Kings and queens eventually became names written into history. But there was one story that refused to grow old. Long after Alpha King Caspar and Queen Mira had passed from this world, a young historian stood inside the royal library, surrounded by shelves of ancient records. He searched through accounts of wars, trade agreements, royal decrees, military victories. Each had shaped Eldoria in some way, yet one simple record had been copied more times than every royal treaty combined. It was not written by a king, nor by a queen, nor by a famous general. It was a single sentence, preserved in the handwriting of an old village teacher. The day our kingdom changed was the day a hungry stranger knocked on the wrong door and found exactly the right person. The historian carefully closed the book. Outside the library window, children laughed as they carried fresh bread through the capital streets. No one worried about where tomorrow's meal would come from. No village feared being forgotten. No child believed kindness belonged only to the wealthy. The kingdom had become exactly what its queen had once imagined on the night she divided her last loaf into 3 equal pieces. And so, generation after generation, the people of Eldoria remembered a truth far greater than crowns, castles, or thrones. Because kingdoms are not transformed by power, they are transformed by ordinary people, who choose compassion when compassion costs them something. Sometimes, the greatest miracle in history is not winning a war. Sometimes, it is simply opening a door, sharing your last loaf of bread, and never knowing that the stranger you saved would one day help an entire kingdom remember how to love its own people. Because no one, not even a king, ever truly knows what kind of future is standing on the other side of a hungry stranger's knock. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and we'll see you in the next story.